Something is happening inside America's justice system, and if you're not paying close attention, you'll miss the moment where everything quietly shifts. It started with a single hearing, routine on the surface, predictable even, until one senator began describing things that didn't sound like politics anymore. They sounded like warnings. Warnings about loyalty tests, about enemies lists, about data systems being accessed by people who shouldn't be anywhere near them, and about federal positions being handed to individuals who treat the justice system less like a responsibility and more like a weapon. The strangest part? He wasn't speculating about the future.
Of Kash Patel's misbehavior. Let's start with the fact that unlike any FBI director before, this guy is a vitriolic partisan. And those are the stripes he shows when he is left to his own devices, and those are the characteristics he will revert back to when he is running the FBI. Just a few simple examples. This is from his book that contains, called Government Gangsters, and this is a page of his enemies list. Well, Attorney General Bondi said nobody should come to a law enforcement job with an enemies list. So then they had to pretend that this was not an enemies list. Well, of course it's an enemies list. Here's what Kash Patel himself says about it. Names named, roadmap unveiled, the manhunt starts tomorrow. If you're going to set up a manhunt against people, are they not your enemies by any logical definition of the term? He goes on to a video that shows himself chainsawing off the heads of the people on his enemies list, including the handsome junior senator from California and the daughter of former Vice President Cheney. It's a pretty gross image to be cutting the heads off of people with a saw. And he didn't put it up, but he retweeted it. He loved it so much that he put it up on his own media. Things like that are not appropriate for an FBI director. They're bizarre for just a normally weird person, but for an abnormally weird person to be the director of the FBI, things are going to go bad. Be warned. He is also a completely sycophantic suck-up when it comes to Donald Trump. He wrote children's books in which King Donald rules, and his loyal little functionary, Kash, brings justice to him, pursuing the slugs of the FBI. Really? When the FBI is asked to investigate corruption in Trump world, do you think Kash Patel will rise to the occasion, or do you think he'll participate in a cover-up? All you have to do is look at his own conduct and his own history. This is not Democrats saying this. What we're doing is relating what he has said and what he has done. This is Kash Patel on Kash Patel. He spread the really abhorrent lie that federal law enforcement was behind January 6th. On one of the many podcasts and interview shows where he spewed so much disinformation and partisan vitriol, he was asked, looks like you have a preponderance of evidence suggesting there may have been federal law enforcement involved in making January 6th happen. Patel's response, I'll get you to beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt, he believed and said federal law enforcement agencies were behind January 6th. We know that is preposterous. We know that is false. We know that investigations have shown that none of that is even remotely true. That is completely false information. And yet, here he is spouting it, and that's what he's going to look like as FBI director, too. The FBI is going to have to appear before judges and convince judges of the probity of the agency, of the legitimacy of the agency, of the propriety of the investigation, that the department has done a fair job of marshaling the evidence. Here's what he says about judges. we got to start impeaching judges if they've ruled against Donald Trump. They were a political terrorist, in his view. Any case that Donald Trump's been charged in, almost every judge is handling this thing as if they were not a judge, but a political terrorist. And of course, he meant the Trump judge down in Florida as the only one accepted. When you start talking about judges that way, you can't then expect judges not to pay attention when you come before them trying to do the work of the FBI. Then there's the question of what his former colleagues have said about him. These are things that he said himself. What have his former colleagues said about him? Every single one a Trump appointee. John Bolton, National Security Advisor. I didn't think he was qualified. I was forced to hire him. Political pressure jammed him into the job, and Bolton said, I don't want any part of this guy. I was forced to hire him. The Attorney General Bill Barr, they tried to force him on Bill Barr as deputy director of the FBI. And he said, Patel has virtually no experience that would qualify him to lead the FBI, and said, over my dead body does he get that job. These are the job recommendations of his own colleagues that show his unfitness. Over at the CIA, they tried to stuff him in someplace. And the director of the CIA, Gina Haspel, I'm no friend of Gina Haspel, but here's what she said about him. If he came over, she would resign before allowing Patel to assume a position as her deputy. This is a guy who has a record of engagement with Trump appointees that show that he is not qualified, not capable, and somebody that they would resign before they'd let work for them. And now we're supposed to let him work for the American people? It is ridiculous. He testified once in state court on a Trump-related case, and his testimony was, to put it mildly, not convincing. Here's what the judge said. The court finds that Mr. Patel was not a credible witness. His testimony is not only illogical, but completely devoid of any evidence in the record. Okay, people come into court, they lie, the court doesn't believe their nonsense, and statements like this happen all the time in court. But here's where they don't happen. They don't happen with federal law enforcement agents. Because when I was the U.S. attorney in Rhode Island, if one of my FBI agents had gone over into the United States District Court in Rhode Island and testified in a criminal case in such a way that one of the United States District judges said about that witness, he was not a credible witness, his testimony was illogical, devoid of evidence in the record, we'd be looking into that. This comes darn close to being what is called giglio material. Material that the government is forced to disclose to future defendants when it bears on the credibility of a government witness, an agent who is a government witness. People lose their careers over giglio material. This, if he was an FBI agent, would have caused a response in headquarters to say, what the hell is going on? How did one of our people get involved in such flagrantly fake testimony that he was called out by the judge in the case like this? And this is the person that they want to put in charge of the organization, whose probity and whose professionalism and whose integrity are essential to the successful working of the organization. And the guy was basically called out as a liar and a fraud in plain court. This guy is a hot mess. And when you have a character like this that lies in court, that runs chainsaw memes about your opponents, that every person who he tried to work with who was senior in the Trump administration said, get this bum out of here, I don't want to be anywhere near him, that's a record. And you all, my Republican friends who are going to vote on this guy, when he gets there and he does what his character tells us he will do.
He was describing what's happening right now. The first sign came when the Attorney General nominee was asked the simplest question anyone in her position could ever face. Did the current president win the 2020 election? That's not a trick question. It's not a legal essay prompt. It's a matter of observable reality. And yet she froze. She avoided. She ducked behind vague phrasing. Imagine being in a room full of senators, many of whom had literally fled in fear during the January 6th violence. and telling them there was a peaceful transfer of power. The kind of thing that shouldn't require courage suddenly became something she couldn't say out loud. That's when people started shifting in their seats. Because when someone nominated to lead the nation's top legal department won't acknowledge basic facts, it's not just awkward, it's destabilizing. But the real unease began when the questioning moved to the man favored to run the FBI. The senator didn't need to embellish anything. He simply recited what was already in the public record. This individual had kept a public enemies list, an actual list of journalists, politicians, critics, and everyday citizens who he publicly labeled as criminals. At one point he even posted imagery of himself chainsawing through the names on that list, as if violence was a joke or a brand. He celebrated it. He doubled down on it. He retruthed it proudly. And when he was confronted about it, he didn't deny it. He tried to explain it away, even claiming it wasn't really an enemies list, despite using those exact words. Now imagine that same person being handed the power to investigate anyone in the country. Imagine giving someone who believes critics should be hunted down the ability to decide who gets investigated, who gets monitored, and who gets targeted. Imagine someone promising manhunts against people who simply challenged his preferred narrative. And then imagine him being put in charge of federal agents. The senator pointed out that this wasn't a hypothetical concern. The man already said he planned to come after members of the media and would decide later whether to do it through criminal charges or civil suits. Those weren't rumors. Those were his own words. And he said he would do it from inside the Department of Justice. But the credibility issues went even deeper. When this FBI pick testified in Colorado, the presiding judge described him using words you almost never see in a ruling. Not credible. Illogical. Completely devoid of evidence. For an ordinary FBI agent, a ruling like that could end their career. It would trigger what's known as a giglio disclosure, meaning prosecutors might not be able to put them on the stand without informing defense attorneys that a federal judge found them untrustworthy. That's how seriously the justice system treats credibility. Yet somehow we are being asked to ignore that ruling and pretend that none of it matters when discussing a man poised to take over the entire bureau. Then there's the Fifth Amendment issue. In a grand jury setting, this same individual invoked the Fifth rather than answer questions. That is his absolute constitutional right. But here's the thing the senator explained that most people don't realize. In civil cases, when someone pleads the Fifth, the jury is allowed to draw what's called an adverse inference. That means they can assume the answer would have been damaging to the person pleading the Fifth. A judge will even instruct them that they're allowed to think that way. So the question becomes, if ordinary jurors in a courtroom are permitted to treat that silence as suspicious, why should Congress be expected to treat it as meaningless? That's where the senator's frustration became unmistakable. He wasn't angry because someone took the Fifth. He was angry because the nominee wouldn't even answer basic questions about it before the Judiciary Committee, the very committee responsible for determining whether he should wield that power over everyone else. But what truly shifted the room was the part that sounded almost unreal. The senator described small groups of loyal operatives, he called them muskrats, running around inside critical financial systems at Treasury and USAID. Systems full of sensitive information. Social security numbers, tax records, payment histories, financial data for millions of Americans. Not only were these individuals in places they didn't belong, rumors suggest they might have been exploring how those systems operate, how information moves, and whether access points can be manipulated. Speculation online points to the possibility of backdoors being created, giving certain powerful allies the ability to view or use that data long after the operatives themselves were removed. Nothing about that has been confirmed, but the concern wasn't outrageous. It was logical, because the senator wasn't guessing, he was laying out the pattern. And the pattern was unmistakable. Freeze funds in Rhode Island despite 2 separate court orders directing the administration to release them. Promote people who threaten journalists. Push for an FBI director who traffics in conspiratorial enemies lists. Elevate an attorney general nominee who can't state that an election was legitimate. Reward violent offenders with pardons, even some who went on to commit new crimes immediately after. One returned to assaulting police officers. Another ended up in a violent confrontation that turned deadly. Another was charged with soliciting a minor. These weren't fringe cases. They were reminders that the administration's idea of loyalty mattered more than public safety, more than precedent, and more than the reputations of the institutions under its control. And that's when the senator drew a line that made the room go quiet. He pointed out that some of these freshly pardoned individuals were part of the same violent crowd that had endangered lawmakers 2 years earlier. The same people who had forced senators to shelter in a secure location after fleeing the chamber. And now the administration was not only welcoming them back into the fold but elevating them as symbols of loyalty. This is where the deeper concern came in. Because in a healthy system, law enforcement works at arm's length from political power. Investigations are based on evidence, predication, and legal thresholds, not revenge fantasies. But when the Attorney General can't say whether an election was legitimate, and the FBI nominee openly threatens critics, the distance between politics and law begins to collapse. The senator warned that when that distance disappears, the justice system stops serving the public and starts serving a person. And the shift doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly through small decisions, strange appointments, and institutional pressure that rewards compliance over honesty. He explained it simply. You need an attorney general who can tell the president no. You need an FBI director who puts the law above loyalty. But instead, the nominees being put forward seem more focused on pleasing the man in the Oval Office than defending the Constitution. That's why he described the Department of Justice as being at risk of becoming the president's political enforcement weapon. It wasn't a dramatic flourish. It was an observation grounded in the behavior of the nominees themselves. Imagine a justice system where investigations begin with enemies lists, where intelligence briefings are filtered through ideological loyalty, where data systems can be combed by powerful allies looking for leverage, where pardons are handed out to people who can help shape political narratives, where prosecutors hesitate because they fear retaliation. That's the landscape the senator was warning about. Not a hypothetical future, but a direction the country is already drifting toward. And the most dangerous part? These changes don't alarm everyone. Some people shrug. Some insist it's just politics. Some think it won't affect them. But the justice system isn't supposed to change depending on who you voted for or who you supported. Once it bends for one person, it can bend for anyone. Turning a blind eye to these symptoms means accepting a world where truth becomes negotiable, where law is conditional, and where those with power decide who gets targeted and who gets protected. That's why the senator ended his speech by insisting that the moment calls for attention, not normalization. He was essentially saying, don't get comfortable. Don't let exhaustion turn into acceptance. Don't assume someone else will notice when the line is crossed. Because this shift doesn't happen with one dramatic event. It happens with a series of subtle ones. An attorney general nominee dodging reality. A would-be FBI director celebrating threats. Operatives in systems they shouldn't access. Court orders ignored. Violent offenders rewarded. Judges calling nominees untrustworthy. These aren't isolated incidents. They're parts of a larger pattern, and patterns become systems when the public stops paying attention to. So if all of this feels unsettling, that's the point. It should. Institutions don't break overnight. They break slowly, then suddenly. And this may be one of those moments history looks back on and asks why more people weren't paying attention. If you want more breakdowns that don't just play the clips but explain the deeper power dynamics behind them, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who still thinks none of this matters. Because the truth is, it matters more than ever.